The Canon 60D. It was announced back in August of 2010. So what's it like using one today? How does it stack up to the cameras of today? So to figure that out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it up against the latest and greatest in this particular lineup, the Canon 90D. I mean, this thing shoots 4K, it's 1080p at 120 frames a second, the autofocus is amazing, and yeah, I think it's just a really good representation of what you can expect from a camera these days, like in this particular price range. So I've identified 4 areas where cameras have improved massively in the last 10-11 years. Those are the resolution and frame rate, the autofocus, the color science, and low light performance. So the Canon 60D shoots 1080p at up to 30 frames per second. And you know what, even in 2021, 1080p is fine. You don't really need 4K for a lot of applications, even though it is nice. One thing I will note though is that the 1080p looks a little softer than what you'd be getting from a lot of other cameras like the 90D, so that's something to be aware of. Now, for cinematic looking footage, what a lot of people like to do is shoot at a higher frame rate and then slow it down in post. Like if you're shooting at 120 FPS, I mean, it's super popular these days. And the 60D does actually shoot up to 60 FPS, but only in 720p. And when a lot of people hear that, I mean, how can you shoot 720p in 2021? Like if I would have told my previous self that I'd be going from 4K on my phone to 720p on a DSLR camera, I just would have thought this is crazy. But you know what? People notice it much less than you'd think, especially if you've got a really nice shallow depth of field. I was working on a project recently where I was mixing and matching 4K footage from the 90D, had some 1080p footage in there, and also some 720p footage from the 60D. And rendered the final thing in 1080p, and you know what? Nobody noticed the difference. Now let's say if you're using like a gimbal or something, in that case you could definitely shoot 24 frames a second in 1080p. But if you're doing handheld and you're trying to get those smooth shots, 60 FPS really does take precedence for me personally over resolution. That said, there will be times when the quality is not good enough. And for me, that would be client work. Like let's say if I'm shooting a wedding, I do want to shoot 60 FPS so I can slow it down in post to get that dreamy feel. But yeah, 720p is just not cutting it for something like that, especially if I'm charging somebody hundreds of dollars for it. So when my Canon 90D was in for repair this summer, I just got a rental. Alright, so that was frame rate and resolution. The next area I'd like to focus on is the autofocus. And for still photography, the autofocus is fine. Like there's the occasional time when it'll be just slightly off, but it works fine most of the time. Now for video, all of that changes. The video autofocus on the 60D is really terrible. Like it's basically unusable. And so I actually created a separate video just talking about how to use the video autofocus, which I'm going to be linking to below. But anyway, a quick takeaway from that video is I really suggest using the AF quick option. So you basically focus it beforehand, the same way you would focus it when you're taking photos. And then that kind of uses the same DSLR style focusing system where it like closes down the mirror. And it's much easier, much faster to focus. And yeah, for video, you'll probably still have to learn how to use manual focus anyway, since focusing it while you're recording is next to impossible if you're not doing it yourself manually. Moving on to color science. Depending on the lighting, I will say the skin tones for the 60D can be a little weird sometimes. But for photography, it's not really a big deal since you're probably going to be editing them in Lightroom anyway, so I wouldn't worry about it for photography. For video, you do notice like the skin tones being a little interesting sometimes, but it's mostly fine. And also, dynamic range is not as good as something like the 90D, so that's something just to be aware of. The last area I'd like to focus on is low light. The 60D is not good in low light. I'll just say that straight up front. It's not good in low light at all. For photography, again, I don't think it's as much of an issue since most of the time, if it's really dark outside and you're shooting photos, you're probably doing something like a long exposure and you're using a tripod anyway. So it's fine for photography, for the low light photography that I do at least. For video though, rule of thumb is basically don't go over ISO 1000, period. Like it just completely falls apart after ISO 1000. So having a lens that lets in lots and lots of light, like I'm using an f2.8 or even an f1.8, f1.4, it's basically a must. And I think I'll link a couple options down below for what I would recommend for lenses that are like particularly for the 60D. I mean, they're good for any camera really, but especially for a camera that has bad low light performance. So yeah, feel free to check that out if you're interested. Alright, to wrap everything up, I just want to focus on a couple different smaller things that have changed over the last 10-11 years. And just things to be aware of. For example, the video dial, like on top, if you want to flip it from photography mode into video mode, you have to turn the dial all the way to the end, which I find a little annoying. Like on newer cameras, you just flip one little switch and that's it. So that's just, you know, those little things. Or like it doesn't have a touchscreen, it doesn't have like a clean HDMI out, so it's not good for live streaming. So yeah, those are just little, you know, quirks that you need to be aware of. So basically, who is this camera for? I think the obvious answer is like for beginners. That's really the thing. If you're just starting out and you have a very low budget, this camera can be used for really maybe 200 bucks, maybe even less. I got mine used for 250 Canadian dollars. And yeah, at that price point, it's really hard to beat, especially if you're into photography. I will say, like, for photography, it's amazing. It really is an amazing photography camera. For video, it really depends on what you're going to be using it for. It's still good for video, it just wouldn't be my first pick, you know, based on things like the autofocus and low light performance and things like that. So yeah, but basically, to wrap this all up, it's far from perfect, especially since there are better options out there. But yeah, I like my 60D for what it is. Alright, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please do me a favor, hit that subscribe button down below. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.